Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm sitting with Kevin Hood Gary, who has written a wonderful and timely book called Why Boredom Matters: Education, Leisure, and the Quest for a Meaningful Life, a book that was published in 2022 by Cambridge, I believe. And Kevin Hood Gary teaches at Valparaiso University in Indiana, and he teaches in the departments of education, theology, and the honors program. So welcome, Kevin, and please tell us about your book and why you decided to write such a timely book. Please.
Yes, thank you. It's wonderful to be with you. I think the question, the study of boredom is personal. I grew up in a family. We moved every 3 to 4 years, and so was confronted with boredom as a kid in a military family, arriving at a new place and having to figure out what to do or how to spend my time. And then in my studies, I gravitated to philosophy and theology, especially to Kierkegaard, and he's written a lot about the phenomena of boredom. And I think it was just a powerful diagnosis of like, wow, he's actually naming my experience. One critic said, well, wait a minute, people aren't bored. We have all these ways of avoiding boredom. And I think that's the key thing is there is boredom, and we've gotten really good at avoiding it. Walker Percy describes modern life as a sophisticated boredom avoidance scheme. And so really fascinated by how we avoid boredom. Studied philosophy of education as well as theology, and was a high school teacher. And as a teacher, you're contending with boredom and trying to keep that elephant out of the room. And in doing that, you might be successful at keeping students stimulated, engaged, but it comes at the cost of them staying at a kind of a superficial level. And so I'm really interested in the problem within schools, but beyond schools, boredom and boredom avoidance, as I got to study in psychology, is really quite pervasive, and it's causally correlated with several troubling behaviors. When we're bored or avoiding boredom, we eat too much, we drink too much. Gambling is linked to boredom. We spend too much, we buy things we don't need, prompted by boredom. Just thinking about our economy is constantly trying to generate the phenomenon or the experience of boredom, so that we need to upgrade our phones, our computers, our countertops in our kitchens. And so it just seems like this problem that it requires an interdisciplinary analysis, which I'm drawn to, having studied in undergrad political philosophy, theology, philosophy of education. And so it just lends itself to bringing in a variety of different disciplines, and is important and significant. And I would say it's an enduring problem. It's something that human beings have struggled with across millennia. It's been diagnosed or labeled and given different categories for understanding it. But I think the experience itself, the fundamental experience of feeling understimulated and restless and looking for some kind of meaningful engagement, is part of the struggle to be a human being and to live well. When I would share with friends and acquaintances that I'm writing a book on boredom, the universal response I would receive almost to a person would be, wow, that sounds really interesting, which I always found amusing, given that boredom is one way to define it is as a state of disinterest. And so the fact that we're interested in this, I think, speaks to our interest in flourishing. And if we're living lives that are characterized by boredom, or we find ourselves in boring work situations or relationships, we're not flourishing as human beings. So it's a topic that just brings together a lot of different areas of study. In the book, what I'm trying to do is do two things. It's kind of two parts. The part one is the problem of boredom, understanding boredom, and so drawing on psychology and philosophy, especially Heidegger, for sort of naming this problem. And then in part two, looking at what's the better or best way to contend with boredom. How do we contend with it wisely? And that's where I'm talking about the cultivation of leisure, and not leisure in the sense of going on a vacation, but leisure as a way of engaging with our world in a more receptive, attentive way. The bored mind tends to be prone to distraction and not sitting with one thing. And to enter into a state of leisure is to be able to cultivate a kind of a deeper kind of attention. And so that's part two. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but that's the basic structure of the book: boredom and then leisure, and then trying to look at some directives for how we cultivate meaningful leisure. And of course, with leisure, drawing on Aristotle, but others as well. I'm in a room here, and it may have gone dark, but my audio works. I'm at a hotel, so pardon the lights going off here, Adrian. So I'll pause there and see if you have any follow-up questions.
Thank you. Yeah, I found your book fascinating because it is a somewhat of a hot topic, to diagnose the culture of distraction and that we all. But you go very deeply back into the tradition and bring to bear a variety of sources to understand this. Just as an observation, right? And we'll get to the issue of leisure, which you retrieve this wonderful tradition of leisure to as a counterbalance or as a solution to the culture of boredom, if I may say so. But it's interesting. I looked up the word. English word otios, right, which comes from the Latin otium, right, which is the name for leisure, right, otium. And otios in English and in other languages means basically not doing anything, a type of laziness, right? It's interesting that it acquired a very negative term in the culture of what we call business, or in Latin negotium, non-leisure, right? Yeah. So we came to I idolize and idealize business, negotium, and really look down on leisure, on otium. So how did we get here? How if you want to just point to a few of these cultural, philosophical changes that got us to the point where we are, right? And I think we're maybe further down, because I think we move from the culture of negotium, of business, to a culture of distraction, where we pursue even more than just business. We look for distraction. So please, how did we get here? Can you? And in the book, it's very clear. You trace that history of mentality. Please.
Yeah, well, the word school, from scola, meaning leisure, this idea that schools are places where leisure is cultivated. And yet schools, especially middle school, high school students, overwhelmingly find school boring. And so something is amiss there too. And just the institutions of school, where we're the aim, or at least the historical aim, was to cultivate leisure, and instead students are feeling quite the work and experience to be quite tedious. How did we get there? I was reading Beyond Good and Evil. Nietzsche describes, he said the English, created or designed the Sabbath to be so tedious and boring that people just couldn't wait to get back to work. And so that's one I thought was an interesting take on it. I think part of it is a forgetfulness about, Aristotle talks about, there's work, and then there's amusement, and then there's leisure, these three spheres. And work and amusement have taken up all the oxygen. And so we work, we're on, and we're engaged, and we're doing some taxing work. And at the end of the day, we just want to relax and to unwind. And there's a whole economy and culture of amusement that's ready to welcome us into the state of just complete relaxation, where we don't have to focus. And they tend to play off each other. So the work is quite draining and exhausting, and the amusement just gives us a rest. And Aristotle talks about, we need amusement like we need medicine, to kind of restore us. But like a medicine, it can do harm if there's too much of it. And so the third sphere is leisure, and it's not characterized by the passivity of amusement. And in the book, I look at actually David Foster Wallace's essay on a cruise. He goes on a cruise to experience what is a kind of a signature capstone amusement experience in Western culture, where you get everything. You get gambling and pools and buffets, and everything is at your fingertips. And he describes the experience as really what it's tending towards is you just want to be completely anesthetized, where your agency is completely, you just don't have to worry about your agency. You don't have to do anything. You can just completely and utterly relax. And he sees sort of the trajectory of that as we're just being kind of, it's the Soma in the Brave New World, just completely anesthetized by the amusement. And we all, I think, can identify with that at a smaller level, coming home, especially with our devices, and just the amusement we get from scrolling all kinds of visual media. It's just a low-hanging fruit of finding relaxation and amusement. So contrasting work where we have to be engaged, attentive, and on, and then amusement, which tends towards this passivity, the kind of leisure that Aristotle talks about and Aquinas picks up on, and more recently Joseph Pieper. Leisure is not the active of work. It's not the passive of amusement. It's this active passive state of being in the world. And I think, we've forgotten that. We've lost sight of that. And I think there's, it's interesting that 100 years ago, if you looked at the vision of education in the United States, the cultivation of leisure was one of the aims. And it wasn't, cultivating hobbies, doing arts and crafts. It was actually bringing a spirit of leisure to chemistry, history, and music, a way of entering into these fields of study so that you experience them as intrinsically interesting and worthwhile, not just as means for employment in the world. And it is amazing that was actually a vision for education. In the United States, there's nothing like that in our national discourse in education. I mean, it tends to be just the hyper pragmatic. We need to get this education for jobs and work in the world. And so there's just a forgetfulness about this other way of being in the world. And it's just sort of etched into the standards and practices of education. The only space of leisure in a U.S. context is maybe arguing over extending the lunch period a little bit or giving a little bit more time for physical education. But this idea of cultivation of leisure or that your subjects could be, spaces where the experience of leisure is enacted is just not there. And so I'm there's a lot more to why we've gotten to where we are, but I think part of it is just there are strong economic capitalistic interests that want to remove leisure from the educational world and let the economy take care of our mood states. And so being kind of thoughtful consumers that are aware of how our boredom states can, drive us into areas or purchases that are just completely not helpful for our flourishing. I think, there's in some ways some interest in there. We don't actually want students to know these things because it will change the way they live and consume in the world. So let me pause there, Adrian.
One of the most compelling arguments that you bring in the book is where you explain how we have very much narrowed, let's say, the scope of education towards educating reason and lost the, let's say, education of the other aspects, right? Both we lost in the intellect as a focus, and I think we lost practical wisdom, right? Because so we kind of are left on a limb there, right? Literally, with a very narrow notion of reason. And if I may, I want to cite a passage on page 77, where you explain this very important distinction between intellectus and reason. So it's page 77, and you say, for Pieper and for Aristotle and Aquinas before him, intellectus is our intuitive faculty. Ratio is our discursive faculty. It is the ego applying itself to understand and make sense of the world. Ratio is a tool we employ for analytical purposes. Intellectus, however, is a disposition of the mind to receive a gift. With ratio, the self achieves understanding. With intellectus, the self receives illumination. This recalls the connection between worship and leisure that Wallace notes. Simone Weil describes the intellectus movement this way: may I disappear in order that those things that I see may become perfect in their beauty from the very fact that they are no longer things that I see. And you explain how Kant is very much part of this reduction to use of this broadness to something rather narrow, right? And it is clear, right, in our educational policy and practice today, how more and more we reduced everything to a very poor and bare bones understanding of reason, if even that, right?
Yeah, that distinction that Pieper really draws out, I think is really key. And I try to bring in some examples because it can sound somewhat abstract. So ratio, the sort of the active discursive mind that is making distinctions and trying to, part of what the ratio critical mind is trying to do is it's trying to name and own things in a way. If I understand something and I can identify it, whereas intellectus is it's not a grasping into ratio type activity. It's really I like the word receptive, where you're open to something and seeing something.
And
Go ahead.
And it's also related to a deep attentiveness as contemplation, right? Theoria, right? So
Yes. Yeah, and some simple examples. When we think about very mundane activities that we're engaged in, I think about it in the context of learning something. A teacher could say, a student might ask, why are we learning this? And the teacher could point to, well, it's state standards, it's going to be on the test, all these sort of extrinsic, reasons or directives or carrots or sticks. But ultimately, most importantly, you want to say because we desire to know. It's, Aristotle said human beings desire to know. We want to know the stars, not just as a possible fuel source someday, but just because contemplation is part of the flourishing and joy of a human being, just enjoying the intrinsic value of what it is you're engaged in. And oftentimes in the school context where students are studying music and sports, they lose sight of just enjoying the very thing they're doing. And that's kind of a receptive move where you're trying to get good at something, but at the same time you want to be enjoying it and savoring it. And that's what gets lost in learning and so many of different contexts. When you look at literally the verbs and educational standards, the verbs are, critique, analyze, dissect, measure. Verbs like contemplate, savor, enjoy, the more affective ways that we engage with the world, the sheer delight. Those verbs just aren't in the language educational standards outcomes. And so in terms of what brains are actually being guided or directed to do, the verbs we might associate with contemplation and leisure are just not even on the map.
And we see that on our syllabi, right? I joke with students that, well, I get called in if my learning outcomes are not measurable, right? So it's an obsessive quantification.
Yep.
And where does this come from? Is this because the business model has become so pervasive in all aspects of our lives, and then everything has to be measured?
Yeah, I think that's been a huge influence in shaping how we devise educational experiences, where you have to have clear, measurable outcomes and then assessments that track to those outcomes. I think the other part of it is, perhaps you said you teach the humanities, and so let's say you're teaching Dostoevsky, and you could set up some tests where you measure their knowledge of the Brothers Karamazov. But I think teachers of literature or poetry or even chemistry or biology, I think what they aspire for most is that the students will come to like, maybe even love.
Love, right?
To love and loving and liking these are hard things to measure, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about being kind of moved in a deep way by the subject, by the content, and so it's hard to measure. A, B. The other thing is there's also some normativity in saying to a student, students who say, well, I just don't like literature. I don't ever say this, but a part of me thinks, that's, I think it was Mark Edmondson he's a professor at Virginia. He had a question on his final exam. And the question was, name two texts that you did not like this semester that we read. And then the second question was, what does that reveal? What deficiencies does that reveal about your character? And I bring that example up, which is to say that, as teachers and professors, we're trying to guide the hearts and desires of our students to these beautiful, beautiful things. And we're saying, these things are intrinsically valuable. You should like them. You should maybe even love them. And if you don't, we can retreat into everybody has their own subjective take on these different things. And I think what happens is we lose intrinsic value. We lose this idea that no, there are some things that are just intrinsically valuable. And if I don't like them, maybe that's a deficiency in me rather than, that's just my particular way of seeing the world.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, as I read the book, the theme of love appears and then disappears. It seems to be very important for you, and you end the book with that wonderful story about your grandmother and how it says you says the ground of leisure is love. Ultimately, it is love that sustains and supports leisure, that provides the patience and vision needed to endure even the bleakest of circumstances. This is hardly a secret. Most people can think of instances in their lives that exemplify this truth. And this theme is not necessarily that developed in the book, right? And it seems to me there are two trajectories. One is Aristotelian, and they don't do love. The Greeks, you have Plato, where you have the love side of Plato, but this other trajectory comes more from a Christian perspective. Can you explain that passage a little bit and how you see, let's say, the theme of love coming together with the theme of contemplation, right?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and you're right that it's underdeveloped. I kind of ended there and realized I was raising some questions that I did not have the space or time to fully address and answer. So one reader actually brought this up at a conference and said, you bring this up and kind of end on it. I was obviously drawn the story of thinking about being with my grandmother in a nursing home. These are spaces that I find quite boring, just as sort of every room there's a TV that's just seems to be running all the time. And the show, I remember The Price is Right was on, which to me is just part of this boredom avoidance of modernity. Let's just, bid on the value of goods for our homes. And so it was just for me as a 25-year-old, just kind of a boring space. And yet I was there with my grandmother in her last days, and I loved her. I love my grandmother. Really a remarkable person and just someone who loved me. And it just seemed like the force of love, the power of love was just this incredible resource to contend with kind of a bleak, tedious space. And I was also thinking with Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard in Either Or, the main character, this is his first, pseudonymous authorship is a character that's just fraught with boredom, poet A, and trying to figure out how to live a life that is filled with engaging, interesting activity and stuff. And so his struggle is between essentially life is boring. How do I make it interesting? How do I keep it interesting? How do I sustain that? And ultimately, he's kind of a sad and I would say pathetic character, and one that I, sadly can resonate with in day-to-day life. We're always trying to find interesting things, interesting clips. Let's watch the next, comedic clip that comes out. And he talks about the bored mind is always sort of trying to just live within that dialectic, the interesting and the boring, and trying to avoid one. This other way of being in the world is infused with love. And so rather than seeing the world as just one occasion of boredom after another, it sees the world as this infinite series of occasions where love can be enacted and brought into the world. And so that just strikes me as a much richer way to be in the world. And how does that relate to leisure? I think it relates to leisure because it's coming back to our capacity for this deep kind of attention, where we're in this active, passive, receptive space, where we're attending to what's in front of us. and most importantly to the people that we are encountering in our lives. And so, Adrian, it's not fully developed, but I think Kierkegaard is pointing to a much deeper kind of resource that sustains it. And also, with Aristotle, the critique there is there's sort of this elitist contemplation. I'm doing leisure when I'm doing philosophy and not the pedestrian stuff. And love opens up the leisure can infuse the very mundane, ordinary stuff. So in doing the dishes a certain way for my family, for my partner, I'm entering into a space of loving leisure. And I don't think Aristotle would ever imagine, and I do make arguments for very mundane things, going for a walk, cleaning, as possibilities for a kind of leisurely engagement. So I think it opens up just a much broader expanse of space. Leisure.
And a much more, let's say, realistic retrieval or rediscovery of the culture of leisure through these quote unquote mundane practices rather than through the top-down tradition of contemplation, right? Whereas I'm engaging in contemplation, right? Which kind of, which we see this artificial attitude a little bit in the culture of mindfulness, where it's become this Mac mindfulness, where everything is as a panacea to all our problems, but it's a very artificial enterprise because there's no organicity to it. I mean, for some it is, but for where it has become itself commodified, right?
Yeah.
So, please, if you.
Oh no, I was just thinking of Benedict, in creating in the 7th century, Benedict's rule was really creating a community of leisure that would be incarnated in the transcribing of the Book of Job or Plato's Republic, as monks were doing, as well as washing dishes and doing laundry and doing gardening. I mean, the whole range of activities were enactments of leisure, and there wasn't the kind of the hierarchy. Aristotle has this clear hierarchy of intellectual, versus non-intellectual activities, and Benedict sort of levels that out, and I think in a very human and wonderful way.
Yeah, actually, I there is a quote I got from the book to this point that this is where a spirit of study, it's on page 107, this is where a spirit of study brought to simple, mundane practices, reading a book or washing dishes, is especially helpful. The cure for monkey mind in the monastic tradition does not involve injunctions to do more thinking, more reflecting, or more praying, but manual labor or simplistic repetitive prayers that require minimal ratio concentration. Within this, the Epiphany cited a spirit of grace is also pervasive. And this brings me to the three things the three directives for cultivating the art of leisure: becoming an apprentice, cultivating a spirit of study, and contemplating or remembering our epiphany. So you offer three remedies or three possible directives, as you call them. Can you speak about each in part? Because I think they're very useful. In fact, they're practical.